All right, so let's move on with the ears. I'm going to start off with the left one. Also, I'm going to map it out first and especially draw in the dark shadow in between the ear and the face. So for that, I'm going to use multiple colors. Definitely some dark indigo. And then some brown as well. And finally some black. I don't want to use just black because it's going to look pretty flat. Let's start off with walnut brown. I'm just going to do a bit of outlining. Filling in the dark shadow. Look at the shape of the face. Then we have some hairs from the forehead overlapping that shadow. So I'm going to be a little careful. We're going to clean that up later as well. Actually, I'm also going to add some Caput Mortem violet on top of that. A little bit of dark indigo on the very darkest parts. So just next to the face. And a tiny bit of black on top of that. And we'll be cleaning this edge up later. I want to do the ear first. Going to sketch out some of the shapes that I see. We have this flap here. Let's sketch out this bottom edge of the ear, doing this with walnut brown. And actually we have a pretty dark edge here as well. So I'm adding some walnut brown there right away. Mapping out the fur direction. And here we have a dark shadow. So look how the fur is flowing on the ear. So I'm just sketching that out. Also have a look at the length of the fur. You can see here that the fur is quite long, and then here towards the bottom it's getting quite short. Alright, so I'm looking at where the lights are and where the darks are. I'm adding a base layer of walnut brown on all the dark areas, so here and here in the center. That's it basically. Alright, I'm switching to Van Dyke 176. Adding a bit of that. Just to increase the variety of browns in there. Actually, I'm going to add a light layer of that on the rest of the ear as well. Just a very even light base layer. I'm not worrying about the edge of the ears yet. Also, this top part is pretty light, so I'm going to leave that open. Increasing the contrast already a bit. Alright, time for some more color. So I definitely see a lot of purple in there, so I'm going to get a Caput Mortem Violet and add a base layer of that on the ear and especially here on the bottom area. You can see a lot of fur texture here, so that's why I'm keeping it so even. And I can do a little bit of fur texture after I'm done with the base layers. Alright, what other colors do I see? I see some pink right here, so I'm going to add some medium flesh. Just quickly glazing that, not worrying too much about textures yet. I see some right here as well. Alright, that's enough. And then I do see a little bit of blue as well. So I'm going to be glazing some sky blue on top. That's 146, by the way. Again, this also helps with fitting the dog into the background. Alright, I'm going to add a little bit of beige red, 132 here, where the ear starts. It's pretty light in here, so adding a bit of this color. Also a little bit here on the top of the ear. I want to make this edge nice and soft so it fades into the background a little bit. And now I'm going to work on building up the layers a bit more. So I'm going to go back to Caput Mortuum Violet and just thicken this layer a bit more. Also, I feel like it needs more yellow, so I'm going to get some yellow, some bistre probably. Yeah, some bistre, 179. You can see quite some yellow right here at the top. I'm drawing some hairs overlapping the background as well. Bit more burnt sienna, or maybe I should add some Caput Mortuum. I always forget that color, but I think it will look pretty nice. That's 169. It's a little less purpley and a bit more reddish. Yeah, it adds some nice depth to the ear. These are still the base layers, not focusing on any fur texture yet. I think I will get to that after this one. Alright, so what I want to do now is start the fur texture by increasing the shadows in between the clumps of fur. So for that I'm going to use a walnut brown. Let's make sure it's very sharp. Right, so I'm looking at all the dark parts now. And now I'm going to work on the details a bit more, so I'm being a bit more careful with where I place my lines. And to really look at the direction of the hairs as well. Now increasing the pressure as well. I'm really looking at where I see those dark shadows. And I keep my strokes about as long as the fur is. So not too long, not too short. I don't want the fur to look too smooth, so I put in my lines pretty dark. Alright, so I feel that's enough for now. I see a little bit of blue right here on the edge. So I'm going to glaze some blue on there. It doesn't need to be very vibrant, but I do think it will add a nice touch to the ears. So I'm going to glaze some Indentherine 247 just on this edge. Maybe some violet as well. Glazing some violets. 138. For some more vibrancy in the fur, I'm going to add a little bit of light magenta. 119. With this piece, I really want to challenge myself to add as many different colors as possible, maybe even more than what I'm used to, and still get a really nice brown look of the fur without adding too much brown in there. Alright, so I feel like now I can start adding the highlights in the fur. I'm going to start off with a little bit of cool gray, 1. I'm going to use that for the tip mainly, as that is looking the most grayish. I'm using this to burnish a little bit to get rid of the texture of the paper. You can always go back over this with some extra color to bring back the vibrancy, but I really want to get rid of that paper texture now first. A little bit of highlighting on the edge. Alright, going to switch to beige red now. Going to use that for this center area, which looks a bit more pinkish. So the more I get towards the top of the ear, the rougher the fur gets. So I'm trying to not be too perfectionistic right here. Switching to ivory now to contrast some of the pink. Let's also use this to create some flyaway hairs from the ear on top of the background. Switching to white for the very lightest hairs. can see this really light strip of fur around the ear that is really catching the light of the sun. All right, let's clean up this edge. I want to add a bit more yellow. So let's use raw umber now. 180. Add a bit more yellow right there. All right, so that's a bit too yellow, I feel. Let's go over it with burnt sienna. I've also lost this dark shadow in the ear a little bit, so let's hype that back up. Alright, so now I'm getting a nice warm tone in the fur. It took some layers to build it up, but we're getting there. Let's add some black, just in this shadow, to really darken that up. And let's also add a little bit of black right here. And maybe a little bit in the very darkest shadows in between the hairs. Alright, so now I need to keep building up the colors, building up the textures. a little bit more brown, adding some Van Dyke brown. Increasing the contrast again. Some little hairs sticking out from the ear, drawing them over the background, and small flicking motions. Going over with my lighter colors again. Pulling out some of the lighter hairs and doing a little bit of burnishing. Hyping up the highlights with white, just a little bit of white. I don't want too much white. All right, now glazing some sky blue along the edges just to make the ear fit in with the background. And still at this stage, the paper is still not saturated. So I can now go back over again. Let's get into these hairs that are overlapping the ear. These hairs are coming from the forehead. So with walnut brown, I'm now going to draw lines from the ear onto the forehead, leaving open spaces in between my lines, which is creating those hairs. This is very important for the shape of the face. A little bit of bistre. Right, I'm going to add a little bit of black. Just in between those hairs. And we're going to clean those hairs up by going over them with lighter colors to bring them out. First, I'd like to do the shadows in between them. All right, I'm going to work on this edge of the face a little bit more. So I'm taking white. I'm going to add those little hairs. Then let's work on these little hairs above the eye as well. So I'm taking some beige red and just create those hairs with flicking motions. All right, we're getting there on this ear. I do have some paper texture left right here, so I'm cleaning that up. This is some burnt umber 280, just glazing somewhere brown. Alright, so finally I'm going to pull out the lightest hairs on the ear with the white. Actually, this edge can be a bit darker. Oh, and the bottom as well. This bottom line can be darker too. So I'm darkening that up with black. Finally, for some more depth, a bit of dark indigo glazing on the darkest parts of the ear. Dark indigo is number 157. And if it's too blue, I can add some purple on top of it, some Caput Mortem violet. So you can always keep adjusting this if you work on pastel mats. Still a bit too much paper texture. Going over with cool gray, number 231. Alright, I think I'm going to leave this ear like this now and move on to the other one. I do feel like this ear has more purple in it now than the rest of the head. So I might do a bit of glazing of Caput Mortem on the forehead, because you can still adjust this if you want to. Alright, moving on to the second ear. First, I need to do a little bit of erasing. I smudged some colored pencil on there, so let's move that away. Alright, so what I'm going to start out with is doing a little bit of outlining and filling in this very dark shadow. I'm going to take a walnut brown again. Right, getting walnut brown. And I'm going to outline this, but not by drawing a harsh line, but I'm going to keep the fur in mind. So I'm drawing these small lines towards the forehead in the shape of the hairs, leaving spaces open in between my lines. Really have to look at all these shapes that I see. This here is very dark, so I'm just outlining it. Right, so this top line is quite light, so I'm not going to add any of the walnut brown around the outlines there. Just focusing on the darkest parts, like here. So it's quite hard to see any detail right here in the bottom, but I'm trying to just see as much of that detail as possible. I don't want to just color this all black because that's going to look very flat. So here the fur is like going that direction. Right here the fur is going in this direction. So I'm spending some time on observing that. Alright, so now I'm going to fill this whole area in with a light layer of walnut brown, just to get started. Here we have a dark shape. Right, so I'm just spending some time mapping this out. All right, so I think I'm going to start with this. So I want to keep on working on this. I am going to add some Caput Mortem Violet in there to increase the depth in the shadow. And then on top of that, I am adding dark indigo. It really creates a nice, dark, deep color. And then I'm adding black for the very darkest parts. Right, and then let's add some Caput Mortem Violet on this edge, as it's quite purple looking. Little bits of violet right here on this edge. And a little bit of blue, sky blue on top of that. And to tone that down, I can add a bit of gray. Alright, so let's move on to doing some base layering on the rest of the ear. Alright, so here at the top, it's again more yellow, just like on the other one. And the bottom is more purplish looking. So I'm going to try to recreate that. I'm going to start off with some nougat, I think. I haven't used it yet. Nougat, that's 178. It's a yellow tone, but not very vibrant, so it's a good base tone. I will clean this up later as well. Looking at the highlights, going around the highlights for now. I'm just drawing little lines in the direction of the fur. And then I'm going to switch to another color for the more purplish tone on the ear, and I'm going to use Caput Mortuum 169 for that. But not too much though, so my pressure is very light. Alright, so I don't need too much of this because otherwise it will look too red. So I'm going to move on to, let's do a little bit of violet because I see quite some violet right here. So I'm glazing that on there. Follow the curve of the ear. And now I'm just going to continue building up my colors. So I see a little bit of burnt sienna right here. Trying to keep it a bit loose. I also see burnt sienna right here on the edge of the flap of the ear. So you never get the colors right from the start. It takes a lot of layers before you get the color right. So it really doesn't matter either if it takes a while to mix the colors. But it's part of the process. I feel like it's more of a process here on pastel mat than it is on the white paper that I work on, the Canson. Maybe because pastel mat can take a lot more layers than my Canson paper can. So I feel like I can be a bit looser. Alright, I'm just going to keep on building up the layers a little bit using Van Dyke Brown. I want to thicken these layers, not yet worrying about the fur texture, but I am always drawing in the right direction. Alright, so right here it's quite dark, so I'm going to darken it up. A little bit more contrast. I'm going to start adding some of the darker shadows in between the hairs now. So right here we also have a very dark piece of fur. I'm going to darken that up even more after this. Alright, so the edge of the ear is quite light. It looks a little bit grayish. So let's add some gray on the very edge of the ear. Let's find a gray to do that with. I'm going to take Cool Gray, number 2. That's 231 to start with. I can always go lighter. Let's add a little bit of that on the edge. Make it overlap the background a little bit. So the top is more yellowish looking, so for that I'm going to switch to ivory. Little bit of the edge on the edge of this flap right here. And then right here, that highlight, it switches to a pink tone. So for that, I'm going to take Let's go with medium flesh. That's 131. Little bit of medium flesh on the edge. And I can always add a lighter color on top of it. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to add light gray on top, cool gray 1, 230. And then the very edge I'm going to highlight with a tad of white. All right, so let's start working on the contrast a little bit more. So I'm going to add a little bit of Caput Mortuum, 169, for the reddish tone in the fur. And I'm glazing that, so I'm putting it on top of the previous layers with a very light pressure on the pencil. Leaving open that very edge that I just colored in with the white. Not too much, so let's go back to another tone and let's do a little bit of violet again. For a bit more of the purpley tone in there, especially here on the tip of the ear. It's quite purple looking. And now I'm going to really work on the dark shadows in between the hairs. So I'm going to get a dark brown. And where is it? Walnut brown, 177. I'm going to hype up the pressure right now. Really darken up those shadows. So there are a few dark shadows on the ear. And I'm not going to perfectly copy what I see. I'm going to recreate the texture, but not every little line has to be in the right place. This can be darker. So let's darken it up. Let's add some hairs coming from the ear. going to add a tiny bit of dark indigo in the dark spot to increase the depth in there. Let's fade that out onto the ear as well, onto the rest of the ear. A little bit of a glare of the dark indigo. And then a tiny bit of black in this dark shadow as well. But not too much. A little bit here along the very bottom edge. Then this here is very dark as well, so I'm going to darken it up. All right, we're getting there. I'm glazing a little bit of burnt sienna. Also going to glaze a little bit of sky blue on the ear, just to get that reflection of the background onto the ear. Make the fur fit in with the background. Now all the base layers are in, so I can just continue adding and changing the colors. Also, I am going to add some highlighting to the fur, and I'm going to do that with, let's do that with gray. as the highlighted hairs do have a bit of a grayish tone to them. So I'm probably going to switch between Cool Grey 1 and Beige Red. Let's start with Beige Red actually, 132. Let's highlight this edge. So the edge of the floppy part of the ear. Now we're going to get rid of the texture of the paper. So I can now start adding some more pressure on the pencil. Really watch that fur direction. Not too much pink. Let's switch to Cool Grey 1. And continue adding some lighter hairs on the surface. And after this, I can go back in and hype up the contrast again. Now I really want to get rid of the grainy texture of the paper. So that's what I am focusing on right now. Some lighter hairs overlapping right here. Pretty easy to do on pastel matte. Alright, I'm starting to get rid of the fur texture now, but I did lose some of the colors as well. So I can go back in, do again some glazing with violet, for instance, and a little bit of light magenta as well. The top part needs some more yellow, I feel, so I'm going to add some Nougat, which is a yellow tone brown, 178. Add a bit of that Nougat here at the top. And back to a little bit of Van Dyke brown. Let's go back to the browns now. Put in some more shadows, some more contrast in the fur. Alright, that's starting to look quite nice. I feel like I want a little bit more blue right here on the ear, so I'm adding a bit more dark indigo again, glazing, not too much because I don't want the ear to be blue, but just a little hue of that will give it a really nice depth to it. Now I'm going to switch to white and really add some nice highlights. Going in between the dark hairs I just drew with the Van Dyke brown. Now I can basically keep glazing until I find that I've reached the right tones in the fur. So I'm adding some burnt sienna again. I feel like the paper texture is not vanished well enough, so I think I'm just going to continue adding more color. So I'm switching between red, pink tones and some yellow tones because I don't want the ear to look too red or too pink or too yellow. So I'm just switching. And back again with Cool Grey 1 because the paper is still not saturated yet, or not enough for my taste. Alright, that's starting to look better. I do want a little bit more sky blue, so I'm just eyeballing it. I never have a complete plan before I start. Keep looking at your own drawing too, see if it needs anything, if it misses any tones. Alright, so now I've flattened out the contrast again, so I'm going back in again with the Van Dyke brown and hype those contrasts back up. can keep on layering with this paper. Now let's work on this little edge a bit more. So first I'm burnishing a little bit with the beige red. And then I'm going to add a little bit of Caput Mortuum violet. Just adding lines in between these lighter hairs. This is pretty blue, so I'm toning that down. Might go over it with Van Dyke Brown because this is very, very vibrant. More Van Dyke Brown to darken up this edge. And then the very ends of the hairs, they can stay light. Alright, that's looking pretty nice. I like how this is coming along. It takes a lot of time, but I'm sure that it will be a very realistic drawing in the end. I hope I will be able to, will be able to finish it before the end of the month, but I don't want to rush it, so I'm going to try my best to finish it in time. It will probably also have more parts than I used to do. Usually I split up my tutorials into about 4 parts, but this is already 4 parts. And then we have to do the rest of the face as well, so this will be 6 parts in total. So I hope you guys are up for a challenge. Alright, so make sure this is nice and dark. Along the edge of the face, follow that form, that shape of the skull. Quite important. Back to the ear. Final touch-ups. Edge of the ear on the top can be a little bit more fluffy, so I'm adding a bit more ivory and overlap the background, making those hairs stick out. Add some white on top of that. Alright, I'm going to leave the ears for what they are now. I can always come back to them. Let's zoom out, see what they look like from far away. Oh, that's how far I can zoom out. Alright, so that looks fine. I think maybe a little bit more red. So looking at the drawings from a little bit more of an angle, from a distance, I mean, that's the word. You immediately see things you can change. It's late already. That's when I start having problems with talking. Also, compare the two ears. See if they look alike. When it comes to the coloring, I can see now that this one can use a little bit more red as well. So I'm just glazing some burnt sienna. Whoops. But I think we're there for the first 4 parts. And now we're going to move on to my favorite part of this drawing, which will be the muzzle. So that will be part 5. First, I do want to add a little bit of color to the eyes because I feel like the eyes are not very expressive enough. Can look a little bit more friendly, so I'm going to make the pupils a little bit larger just by adding some brown around them. So I'm not adding black to them, but a little bit of brown along the edges. A little bit more sanguine. Bit more nice orange. Maybe even a little bit of red. Let's go for deep red. Just want to make the eyes a little bit less bright. I feel like they are too bright right now. Takes away from his expression, so I'm going to add also a bit more burnt sienna along the edges of the iris. I think that looks a lot better. Yes, I like that. All right, let's move on to the next part. Part 5, which is going to be the nose and the whole muzzle area.